Good morning, everyone. For the benefit of Commissioner Millett and those listening online, my name is Ann Marquith, and I am a biologist out of the Wilmington office and the Sheepshead species lead. In 2024, you asked the division to investigate if proactive management changes were needed for the Sheepshead fishery based on trends in the recreational and commercial fisheries. So that is why I'm sitting in front of y'all today. While some of the data in this presentation can be found in the annual updates that Charlton just spoke about, the additional information is included in the issue paper that is currently being finalized. So just a quick overview of this presentation. I will be going over some basic life history traits for those unfamiliar with the species and review the management background for Sheepshead. The majority of the presentation will focus on the current data trends, and I'll end with next steps or how the division will be moving forward with Sheepshead management. Sheepshead can be found from Nova Scotia through the Gulf of Mexico to Brazil. Genetics data indicate that sheepshead on the Atlantic coast are considered to be one stock and distinct from those fish in the Gulf of Mexico. They are found year-round in North Carolina and are a structure-oriented fish with adults utilizing habitats such as oyster reefs, as seen in the picture, rocks, pilings, jetties, piers, and wrecks. Tagging studies have shown that not only do sheepshead tend to stay in the same area throughout the year, often fish are recaptured on the same dock or reef where originally tagged, but they also have high site fidelity, meaning after the fish move offshore to spawn in the winter, they return to the same area, if not micro area, year after year. Sheepshead are relatively long-lived species with the maximum reported age of 35, and this was from a fish in Virginia. The maximum age recorded in North Carolina is 34. However, these older fish are relatively rare in our data set. And despite their longevity, sheepshead mature young, 50% are mature by age 2 or 12 inches fork length, and 100% are mature no older than age 5 or 16 inches fork length. Until 2012, sheepshead had been managed as part of the South Atlantic Fisheries Management Council's Snapper Grouper FMP. During that time, there was no size limit. For the recreational fishery, sheepshead were included in the 20-fish aggregate bag limit, where up to 20 of those fish could be sheepshead, and there were no commercial trip limits. The council removed sheepshead from the FMP in 2012, along with several other species, where at least 95% of their landings came from state waters. The removal of sheepshead from the FMP invalidated the DMF's proclamation authority under the interjurisdictional species rule, effectively resulting in no regulations on sheepshead. Due to the concern over increasing landings and the exploitation of juveniles from the lack of a size limit, the North Carolina Marine Fisheries Commission asked for a rule to be developed allowing for management of sheepshead at its November 2012 business meeting. The sheepshead rule was approved in November 2013 and became effective in 2014. This rule gives the fisheries director the authority to specify time, area, means and methods, season, size, and quantity in the taking of sheepshead. The division began developing potential management options for sheepshead in 2014, and the public was provided with opportunities for input during that development process. In 2015, this commission approved management that implemented a 10-inch minimum fork length for both the recreational and commercial sectors, a 10-fish bag limit for the recreational sector, and set various trip limits within the commercial sector. So 300 pounds for most gears, a 10-fish trip limit for spears and gigs, and there was no trip limit on pound nets. There is currently no state or federal FMP, nor is there a peer-reviewed stock assessment for the North Carolina portion of the sheepshead stock. However, the proclamation authority through the sheepshead rule does allow for management changes to be made. You just heard from Charlton about the annual FMP reviews that occur every year. As there is no stock assessment for sheepshead, division staff monitor any changes in data trends for sheepshead using the annual updates as the mechanism to evaluate the data and discuss any concerns. And so included in this annual update for sheepshead, we look at relative abundance indices, recreational commercial catch data, length compositions for the surveys, as well as the sectors and the age composition. And I'm going to walk you through each of these data sources, starting with the relative abundance indices. There are 2 relative abundance indices that are looked at annually, a juvenile index, which uses the data collected from Program 120, the Estuarine Trawl Survey, and an adult index, which uses data collected in the Program 915, the Independent Gillnet Survey. The subset of samples used to calculate both indices are from the Pamlico Sound. The juvenile index uses data collected in June and July from the speckled trout-specific stations, as both species utilize similar habitats as juveniles. The adult index uses data collected May through November on the eastern side of the sound. I do want to focus on the adult index, as the juvenile index is variable without any real trend, but if you are interested in the juvenile index, that figure is in the annual update, as well as some additional information. And while we're on this slide, I do want to point out this picture. So this Commissioner Roller did go with our Moorhead Gillnet crew to sample. You can tell he looks really happy. They actually caught some sheepshead that day, but I am doing this as a plug. So if you have not gotten to go out on any of our surveys, please get up with us, and we would love to take y'all. Commissioner Service went with us last week. I know Tom enjoyed his time, so shameless plug for fisheries management.
I would recommend it.
Important thing I learned that day is I don't think there's anything harder in fisheries than pulling a sheep's head out of gillnet mesh.
Yes. All right. So, getting into the data from 915, this figure shows the relative abundance, adult abundance of sheepshead from the 915 survey. The years are on the x-axis or horizontal axis, and the relative abundance is on the y-axis or vertical axis. The relative abundance is calculated as the number of sheepshead per set, or 240 yards of gillnet, and the shaded area on this figure is plus minus 1 standard error. From 2001 to 2007, the relative abundance of sheepshead was low with little variability. However, since 2008, the adult index has shown an increasing trend, with 2004 representing the highest relative abundance. Great news. That's a good thing. We want to see that. The other piece of information that we can look at from the 915 data is the length composition of sheepshead caught in the survey. This figure shows the length frequency of sheepshead from the survey used to calculate the relative abundance index seen on the previous slide. And this is the length frequency bubble plot that you typically see in our annual updates for the recreational and commercial data. So since this is the first time you'll be seeing this figure in this presentation, but definitely not the only time, I do want to take a minute to walk you through exactly what you are looking at. So year is on the x-axis, and fork length is on the y-axis. The size of the bubble represents the proportion of landings in each 1-inch size bin for a given year. The bigger the bubble, the more fish observed in that size bin or size class. There are some additional horizontal lines on this figure in dark red, and they include the current 10-inch minimum size limit for the recreational and commercial fisheries, so that solid line, length at 50% maturity, which is the dashed line, and length at 100% maturity, the dotted line. One of the really cool things about this figure and this data is we can follow several cohorts or year classes of fish throughout the years, and this can be helpful in explaining landings trend, particularly if we see the same trends within the length comps for those fisheries. Cohorts are determined based on the change in size classes, with the expectation as fish grow, the proportions will shift to larger and larger size classes over time. For example, let's look at the period from 2007 to 2012, starting with 10 inches in 2007. You can follow this particular cohort of fish through 08, 09, 2010, 2011, and 2012. So super cool. We don't always see that in our data, so that is something nice with the sheepshead data. So while the 2007 to 2012 shows the clearest example of a strong cohort, there are several years where you can clearly see other cohorts moving through, and in some cases, multiple cohorts within a similar time frame. So again, this is super nice for the sheepshead data. Aside from the cohorts, though, this figure shows that the fish caught in the gillnet survey range from approximately 7 inches to 22 inches fork length, dependent on the year. Due to the nature of the survey and the use of nets of differing mesh sizes, most years a wide range of lengths are captured. However, due to the selectivity of the gear, we do not see the larger fish that show up in the recreational and commercial fisheries. We max out at about 22 inches. Well, we max out at 22 inches most years, 20 inches, and we see 25, 26-inch fish in the rec and commercial sectors. So one thing to point out is that most fish caught in this survey are less than 16 inches, which is that dotted line, meaning a lot of these are younger and potentially immature fish that we capture in this survey. Now, I do want to take a second to look at the fish that are 15 inches or greater. And so when you do look at those larger fish, you can see there is a little bit of size truncation or lack of larger fish that occurred in that 2007 to 2013 time period. The larger fish were seen in prior years, so in 2001 to 2006, and then starting in 2014, these fish begin to reappear in the survey and have been consistently present though the proportions have been variable. And this is important because while we would like to see maybe larger bubbles or a larger proportion of those bigger fish, at least they're consistently there. So that is a positive. All right, so good things with the surveys. Moving on to the recreational. Yes, sir.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, while you're at this survey, can you just go back? Mm-hmm. So do you feel like the larger fish, because they get quite large, mm-hmm. and I mean significantly larger than 20 inches and 25 inches at places, I mean you see it all the time in the Chesapeake Bay, they catch them all over that bridge. Do you feel like they just don't use the system, or that you just don't have a survey to capture them in the estuarine waters of North Carolina, or they just are ceasing to exist? Because I feel like, I mean, you know, I feel like there's you're missing quite mm-hmm. a few fish here based on what I know about other knowledge in other places. And where those, you know, where larger fish are consistently located at, especially, you know, the Chesapeake Bay system. So I'm just curious to know is there a gap there that you're just not able to survey those large fish, or?
And so I do think it's twofold. So yes, I think with this particular survey, because of where we set the nets and the selectivity of the gear, and they are structure-oriented fish, we are probably missing that larger, because those larger fish are even spookier than the size classes we're capturing. So I do think there's that. I also think, to your point about the size class of fish seen in Virginia, even when you look at the commercial and recreational data, we don't see fish that large. So I do think it's kind of twofold. It's kind of where we are in the range. And then for the survey, we may not be capturing some of those fish.
Right. Yeah, so just a follow-up comment. You know, the success of the Sheepshead fishery around Chesapeake Bay depends on those sonar units along those pilings. They can pull right up, park that boat right there, see those fish on that piling, and they can target right there. I mean, they know exactly where that fish is sitting at. And so, you know, I think that fishery has expanded because of technology in recent years. And so, you know, that's concerning too. Technology is concerning because it really gives the fish a huge disadvantage in my opinion. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, and just to add to the technology piece, you know, the Bassmasters came to Elizabeth City and fished the Pastank River this year. Mm-hmm. The dude won the daggone tournament and busted the record by tons of pounds, like significantly, because of this sonar piece, and he hardly went anywhere from the boat ramp. Everybody else run around the sound. It was blowing, getting beat up. They were running around trying to find fish. This dude took his sonar unit, took his trolling motor, and just left the boat ramp at Elizabeth City waterfront and won this with huge fish. And so, I've been fishing around there all my life, and I could never consistently catch that many big fish, especially bass fishing, because that was, what I grew up doing. And so that's a concern in the fishery is like, if technology is getting to be too much on these fish, how do you regulate the technology? And that brings a whole new question here. And so how do the businesses are making money off of building these systems, millions and billions of dollars it takes to develop this stuff. But it gives these fish a huge disadvantage. And so where do you draw the line at, and how do you draw that line? And I think that's a huge question to try to answer. And I just kind of wanted to put that in there by seeing this right here and just knowing the biology of these fish. They get significantly larger than what you're showing here.
Go ahead, Tom.
Thank you, Commissioner Blanton. I want to touch on a couple things you said. I really appreciate you bringing that up. This is why I asked the commission in the division to do this analysis and look at this fishery in particular. The idea of regulating technology, I think, is somehow it's going to happen, maybe not here, but at some point in the future, it's going to be something that has to be discussed. Otherwise, we're going to literally being responding to these fishermen changes. I think that's another question. But when we look at some of the technologies out today, forward-facing sonar, which is what I assume you're referencing to, is becoming a big issue, fisheries nationwide. There's been a lot of discussions in the Midwest about how it's affecting muskie fishermen, right? And what I mean by that is used to talk to fishermen 10, 15 years ago, and they'd fish all summer to catch a couple fish over 45 inches or whatever metric they have. Now you talk to people in the same area and said, I went out today, I only caught 3 40 inches. Because now people can drive around the lake, and they can look for those fish on their forward-facing sonar, and they can cast to them, right? And so what does that do? That increases mortality in some of these fish when it makes them easier to catch. And when it comes to sheepshead, while it's not just these technology changes, it's in these circumstances, like you said, it's making these bigger, older fish much easier to be targeted. And that's one reason why I wanted to have this discussion to see what the trends in this fishery look like.
John?
Yeah, I had a question. The only way you're doing sampling currently is gill netting, correct?
In terms of,
How you're sampling to get the fish to the sheephead, you're just using gill nets?
so we have multiple sampling surveys that may encounter sheepshead. The one that we have the data for, like the most data, it's not a lot of zero samples, is the gillnet survey.
Okay. The reason why I'm asking that, because I'm just thinking if y'all considered any other reasons why you might not be coming up against frequenting the bigger fish. I'll give a perfect example. Obviously, we know that they hang around structure. So your recreational fishery catcher, because they're hanging around the oyster rocks, the docks. Well, you're not going to be able to set a gill net there or trawl by there anyway to even catch them. So you're not going to fish them places. But also, I have commercial divers who I purchase fish from. And a lot of those big fish within the 3 mile range of here, they're in the ocean. They're around up because kind of like when we brought up when 442, half a mile off the beach in North Carolina, there's so many rocks and ledges and stuff, and it's full of huge sheephead. And nobody's setting them because we could go out on boats and catch them. So just taking this as an option that a lot of those fish, when they reach a certain size, you might not be seeing them. They might have moved off to the rocks and ledges that's off of our coast here in that 50-foot and shallower range. Because I know people that see them and catch them out there a lot too. So just thinking about that.
And that is a good point. I know our habitat enhancement staff who does do dive surveys on the artificial reefs has mentioned they do see sheepshead on those artificial reefs. We just don't have any length composition data to go with that. And it's just more of a plus minus seeing them. But that is a valid point.
Yeah, Tom.
And thank you for bringing that up, Commissioner Millett. It's definitely the targeting of those fish on nearshore structure. And I do have a question for you on this. Has been a newer phenomenon. Right, people have been doing it for a long time, but it seems like there's more recreational fishermen fishing those aggregations as well as more spear fishermen, commercial and recreational. And isn't it that because there's forming spawning aggregations out there? Isn't that what we understand? That's why in the springtime, you can go out and just whack them. And while there'll still be some in the summer, they tend to be pretty concentrated at a certain part of the year. Can you
Yep.
comment on that?
That's correct. So Sheepshead, they're actually very similar to flounder in terms of you get some of those blows at the end of the year. They're going to start moving out, aggregate offshore for spawning, and then spawning occurs between February and May. So, and then they start moving back in.
Yeah, John.
Just one last point, kind of go, Commissioner Roller said. I also, and maybe this is just a personal observation, but I'll go with it. You're gonna see a lot more of recreational catchers of sheephead just because the same people fishing these areas can't go flounder fishing. So these people are on vacation, they're spending their money, they got these boats, they got everything. They can't go catch flounder, so they're gonna go target something else. And that's why you're seeing a lot more people targeting sheephead by the bridges, where it used to be sheephead, it was a lot harder to catch, people didn't take the time. Well, it's just something to always think about, and just because they can't go catch flounder, well, not all those same people, they're targeting sheephead. And also sheephead, there's plenty of them, which is good to see it, and which I'm not gonna start that argument, there's plenty of a lot of things, but is just as a thought of why you're seeing a lot more.
Yeah, and both to your and Commissioner Roller's point, some of that data actually is going to, well, as I go through the presentation, some of that will come up, so.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. I just want to add to what Tom was saying about sonar. When we add GPS-enabled trolling motors or spot lock to that process, we're really able to target fish for prolonged periods too. And I mean, it's putting intense pressure on sensitive spots for prolonged periods. And if it's not just one angler, it can be many anglers sitting on the spot, and it can, one person leaves, another boat moves in, and these units are getting really affordable. So it's not just that we have more people out there, we have more people with that technology too, and it's concerning.
Okay.
All right. So I do want to now get into the recreational and commercial landings, and this is kind of where the concerns relative to the Sheepshead fishery come from, because while the survey looks good, there are some trends that we're seeing that do raise some concerns. There are a couple things I want to go over before I get into that. First, as I go through these slides, you're going to notice the date range is only 2009 to 2024. 2015 data is not included due to the management being enacted mid-year. However, the pre-2009 data as well as the 2015 data can be found in the annual updates. So it's not that it's not available, it's just for the sake of the presentation and looking at the data in a easier way, we're just focusing on that 15-year time period. Now, before I really get into the fisheries trends too much, I do want to orient you to the layout of the landings figures shown throughout this presentation. One, the majority of figures will have year along the x-axis, and the y-axis variable will change depending on what's being shown. So in the case of the figure on the slide, it's the percent of the total Sheepshead landings. There is also going to be a dashed red line where the 2015 data should be to indicate the pre and post regulation years. Now, getting back to the figure at hand, since 2009, approximately 85% of Sheepshead landings have come from the recreational fishery, as indicated by the yellow portion of the bars. And though this has been closer to 90% in the last 5 to 6 years. I do want to note, though, that this is not a change from historic data, and the Sheepshead fishery has always been a recreationally dominated fishery. And since the rec fishery is the major player in the Sheepshead fisheries, I am going to start with their trends first. So landings in the recreational fishery are predominantly hook and line, though there are anglers who gig or spear for Sheepshead. Landings from the gear types have been combined for this presentation. Recreational landings have fluctuated annually, which are represented by the yellow bars on the figure and associated with the vertical axis on the left that shows pounds. There was an initial drop in landings after management was implemented. However, landings have shown a general increasing trend and have been on par with pre-regulation values. Recreational landings in 2024 were 1.42 million pounds of fish, the highest since management was implemented, the highest of the time series shown, and the second highest of the recorded recreational landings. While the increase in landings, in particular the last 4 years, is a concern, perhaps more of a red flag is the increase in directed trips that have been observed, represented by the black line on the figure and associated with the vertical axis on the right. For sheepshead, directed trips are defined as those trips where sheepshead were identified by anglers as either the primary or secondary target species. Between 2020 and 2021, effort more than doubled after being relatively stable for the previous decade. Effort has remained high, and even when landings dropped in 2023. Now, sheepshead is a targeted recreational fishery, meaning the angler goes out with the intent to catch them. This figure shows the percent of harvest based on the number of fish kept by angler, with the different colors of the bars representing the different numbers of fish kept. The majority of anglers only land one fish, indicated by the dark blue portion of the bars, and this was true both pre- and post-regulation changes, though obviously that percentage has changed slightly based on the size limit change. In the last 5 years, there has been a slight increase in the proportion of anglers landing 2 to 4 fish, and in 2024, the proportion of anglers landing 6 or more fish was greater than 5%, the highest since implementation of regulations. This change in success, even slight, likely contributed to the observed increase in landings. Now, I do want to note that while increasing success is not necessarily a bad thing, it is the increased success coupled with the increase in effort and interest in this fishery, as raised by several of y'all in that conversation that just occurred, that raises the concerns about the harvest levels. Now, one other important piece of information relative to the recreational sheepshead fishery is that there's been a shift in landings over time, both at the monthly level and in space. These figures represent the percent of recreational landings pre- and post-regulation change for the MRIP sampling wave, so January, February time period, March, April time period, et cetera, and the area fished, internal coastal, and state and federal ocean waters. While peak harvest is during the July-August sampling wave, the figure on the bottom, which represents 2016 to 2024 landings, shows an overall shift to the fall and winter months, as well as a marked increase in the state ocean landings during the November-December sampling wave, to get to Commissioner Roller's point about spawning aggregations and potentially the nearshore reefs being targeted. And so this is a concern because those fish are aggregating at that time.
Yes, sir.
And those landings lump gig, spear, and hook and line all together?
Yes. Okay, so now moving on from the landings data to the length composition data, this is the recreational length frequency bubble plot that you will find in the annual update, which is why the time series is slightly different, because the time series in that annual update is different than what the issue paper will be. As a reminder, the larger the bubble, the more fish that were observed at that length, and the dark red horizontal bars represent the current size limit, the size at 50 and 100% maturity. Unlike the figure for the 915 data, there is less clear evidence of strong cohorts or year classes moving through the recreational data, especially after implementation of management. This is most likely due to the fact that anglers are just keeping what they catch. You know, you don't know what's going to be at the end of your hook. But really, and more importantly, the major take-home from this figure is that a large proportion of fish harvested are younger and potentially immature, and 85% of the landings from 2016 forward are those fish that are 16 inches or less, so right at or below that 100% maturity value. Now, I do want to focus particularly on the area of the figure that is the 15 inches or above, and hopefully, Commissioner Blanton, this will also get to some of your comments about some of the larger fish. And so if we look at that 15 inches and above, you'll notice the larger fish really aren't showing up in the data like they did historically. So, for example, in 2001, a 30-inch fish was intercepted. This seems to be a one-off. We don't really see that. So while it could be considered the maximum size, it's probably safer to assume maybe 25 inches is a more realistic maximum length for most years. And most years we're not seeing above, is less than 25 inches. Additionally, prior to 2008, fish larger than 20 inches, which is indicated by the purple box, were approximately 12% of the observed catch. And while this value has been variable since management implementation, it only averages now approximately 3%. And the reason I point this out is to say that with a length expansion, we would expect to see more larger bubbles above 20 inches like we see in the 2002 to 2007 time period than currently show up in the data. And so the initial management that was put into place, size truncation or those lack of bigger fish was a concern, and it does not seem to have changed since management in 2015. We're still seeing some size truncation there. Now, I do want to switch gears and talk about the commercial fishery. This is a similar figure to what you saw with the recreational landings and trips. There are two main differences, though. One is the scale for the weight and the trips is much lower for the commercial fishery than the recreational. And two, the bars show multiple gears, and these are the main gears: the estuarine gill nets, pound nets, spears and gigs, and then the other category, which is anything else that may have landed a sheepshead, instead of a singular value. 80% of the landings are from pound nets and estuarine gill nets, and that's indicated by the blue and green proportion of the bars. From 2013 to 2022, commercial sheepshead landings showed a declining trend and averaged less than 100,000 pounds after implementation of management. However, landings increased in 2023 and again in 2024. And as with the recreational fishery, the landings in 24 were the highest since management was implemented. Effort, or trips landing sheepshead represented by the black line, has also declined over this same period. However, starting in 2020, the number of trips with sheepshead landings has increased. And while this matches the timing of the effort increases in the recreational fishery, the magnitude of the increase is much smaller. And to be very clear, while this is the number of trips looks to be trending up, 2020 was a historic low, and even though the trips might be increasing, they are still well below the historic average. So really, what's more important for the commercial fishery is to point out the landings values relative to this effort and how the landings per trip have changed in the recent years.
Yeah, Mike.
So what's interesting to look at here is the last 2 years, is 23 and 24. You had significantly less trips, and through the time series, it seems like the landings trend very general with the trips. So what is the, how are the fishermen being more successful going less trips but being more successful? What's the, what is the thought behind that?
So I think there's probably twofold with this, with the commercial fishery. In general, sheepshead has been more of an incidental catch. Like if they caught it cool, like that was extra money, they could sell it. I think and to Commissioner Millett's point with the flounder seasons being what they are and changes in regulations with other species, that's what's driving some of the recreational fishery patterns as well as the commercial patterns. And you're starting to see, I think, more fishermen keeping sheepshead where they might have thrown them back in the past because the price per pound is going up. But also, there are more trips landing, and this, in the next 2 slides you'll see this, but there are a lot more trips landing higher numbers of sheepshead. And some of that is maybe when they're deciding to set gear. I know, I'm not sure I have a really good explanation right now. I think it's just a shift in the fishery in terms of, because it's one of the few things, people are going out to target it more, and so maybe keeping more fish, like, because they're specifically targeting it versus keeping them as like, oh, they set their flounder net, they happen to get some sheepshead, they may set small mesh or something else, where, you know, what gear, like, or a finfish pound, instead of flounder pounds, maybe they're doing finfish pounds to capture that.
Okay, well, Tom and then John.
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously, with the flounder catches being down, pound net effort's down, correct? Yet we see pound net catches go up here. Are these fish being caught in the flounder pound net fishery, or are these more along the lines of other, like, what would you call them? I know, I mean, there's pound nets and fish pounds set in other areas of the state for during the summer and other times of year.
They're considered finfish pounds, so like you have flounder pounds, bait pounds, and then finfish pounds, and it would be the general finfish. I
Okay,
think-
so these are being caught throughout the term of the year during, using finfish pounds. Do we have any trends in like that fishery, or is there more of that, or?
I do not have it with me. I can definitely get that information.
That would be interesting.
Okay, John.
Just as a, as an observation, going by, following up to Commissioner Blanton's question, as a dealer who purchases quite a bit of sheephead from a lot of people, just the way the pound net works, in my opinion, just shows how many more fish there is. You got a set of gill net, you're doing all stuff. The pound net, the fish that are just in the area are swimming into it and getting caught. You're not setting it on a body of fish. So just for them making less trips and having more sheephead, generally, obviously, people, there's more sheephead, but they're catching, if the numbers are going up in less times that they're, you know, checking the nets. I mean, that's just pretty straightforward, I would believe.
And I think, so to add to that, there are, because of the regulations on flounder, there are several fishermen who, while historically have set flounder pounds, have switched to finfish nets. And in switching to finfish nets are doing so to be able to take advantage of other species like sheepshead, black drum, et cetera. And so it's kind of twofold, like pound nets are incredibly effective at catching fish as they move. But I think it's also the difference, and you see the shift, and we know this from just the permitting aspect. You see a shift from flounder pounds to more general finfish pounds, and that's just so the fishermen who might have historically done only flounder fishing are now taking advantage of the other.
Yeah, and those guys know where those fish move through, and they move those pounds from where they were catching flounder to where the sheepshead migrate, so makes them a lot more effective. Yes, sir, Willie.
I'd just like to add that I've observed, at least in the Hatteras Village area, that there's a very limited period of time that there's a tremendous amount of sheephead being brought in commercially. So I think the effort is only when there's knowledge that the sheephead are out there and are easily available, so that you don't do that all year round. You only do that in these 2 weeks, and you wipe them out then, and then you don't fish for them anymore because the ability to catch them is probably down.
I would definitely say that's true for pound nets. There is a movement pattern there that pound nets have an advantage and can take advantage of. But we do see sheepshead landings year-round. It just happens to be the peak is in the same months as flounder. And it has always been, regardless. Like, it's in those fall months.
Yeah, Tom.
So when we talk about finfish pounds, what region of the states are those fishing in?
Corsair North. We don't have any
Corsair
pound.
North, so it's in the more central northern part
Yeah.
of the state. Okay.
Yeah, we don't have any pound nets in the southern area.
Well, like, clear, I was just curious if there was one section of the state or other which was seeing more finfish pounds.
That I don't know. Again, we could get that data, but I think in general, we're just seeing the permitting change.
All right, you can go ahead.
Okay. All right. Lost track of where I was. I think I was done with this slide, so moving forward. So the next two slides that I'm going to go over have figures that show the percent of trips landing sheepshead based on 100-pound increments. But both the pound nets and then for all other gears, but the gigs and spears. And the only reason I'm not talking about gigs and spears today is because the 10 fish trip limit generally limits landings to 100 pounds or less, so it's not really showing the same data trends. But before I go over what this figure is showing, I do want to note the scale on the figure being shown. The y-axis is starting at 70% rather than 0%, and this is just to better show the data patterns. And just also as a reminder, there are no trip limits for sheepshead on pound nets. So what I want to draw your attention to is the dark blue bars, which represent the proportion of trips landing 100 pounds or less. And what you will see is if you look at these after 2020, that they're starting to make up a smaller and smaller proportion of the entire bar, while trips landing more than 100 pounds make up a large proportion of the bars. In fact, trips landing 200 pounds or more, particularly post-regulation, have increased from approximately 10% of the landings contribution to, in recent years, up to 25%. Additionally, the number of trips landing greater than 500 pounds have increased, especially in 23 and 24. And one thing to point out here, while it is not shown but is included in these trips, is there are several trips in the last 2 years of 1,000 pounds or more, some between 2,500 and 7,000 pounds. So that is that part of that driver of that increase in the greater than 500 pound trips. So now this is the same graph as the previous slide, but for all the other gears, again, with the exception of gigs and spears. In this graph, the vertical axis is going to start at 90% rather than 0% to better show the data patterns. And as a reminder, these gears have a 300 pound trip limit. As with pound nets in general, the proportion of landings over 100 pounds of sheepshead has increased since 2020, making the proportion of the bars that are dark blue smaller. The proportion of trips, though small, hitting the bound of 300 pounds is beginning to increase. And there are several possible reasons for the increases in trips with higher landings for both gear and the type shown. And we kind of discussed this already in the discussion that just occurred. And again, part of that is it's becoming more of a desirable species, not only to retain, but also to target, and because of the regulation changes with other fisheries. And so while this is not necessarily a bad thing, same with the recreational fisheries, those trends aren't necessarily a bad thing, but it is something to keep an eye on. Now, moving to the commercial length composition, the bubble plot shows similar trends to the recreational sector in that a large proportion of the fish harvested are younger and potentially immature. Potentially immature. So 87% of the landings from 2016 forward are 16 inches or less. And while we don't see strong evidence of year classes moving through these links like we did with the 915 data, we do see some clearer patterns of year class strength than what we did with the recreational data, especially in 2007 to 2012, and to a lesser extent, 2021 and 2024 timeframes, which means some of the year class strength may be better explaining the commercial data than it does the recreational. And some of the reason we may actually be seeing these patterns is just because of the gear that is used in the commercial fishery versus the rec. And you have pound nets, which capture all sizes. Gill nets can capture all sizes, whereas, again, hook and line, it just happens to be what's on your hook that day. All right. Well, there's that box that was supposed to be there. So now, similarly to the recreational fishery, the larger fish are not showing up in the data like they did historically, again, indicating there's probably still some size truncation going on. There we go. And so, for example, we have a 27-inch fish in 2000. We don't see that again. And for most years, the maximum observed length is less than 25 inches. Additionally, prior to 2008, fish larger than 20 inches were approximately 15% of the observed catch. And this value has been variable since management implementation, but like the recreational fishery, averages approximately 3%. And we would hope after implementation of management, when we had concerns about size truncation in the past, that we might see more of those larger fish showing up in the landings, so some larger bubbles in that 2016 to 2024 timeframe. In addition to some of the concerns relative to the landings and length data, we are seeing what looks like a potential age truncation in the population, meaning fewer older fish are being seen. Now, I do want to point out that until 2013, sheepshead was not a priority species for age structure collection. So you'll notice this time series does not start in '09. And there is some data from previous years, but it's not from statewide collections, which is why we're only showing 2013 forward. This figure shows the relative contribution of each age group annually for the samples collected. This data is shown by age group just to make the patterns cleaner to see in the presentation, though individual age data will be in the issue paper, and you can find some of that in the annual update as well. The majority of the sheepshead sampled annually, whether from division surveys or the recreational and commercial fisheries, are age 5 or less, which are represented by the lower blue portion of the bars. If you remember from the length frequency graphs, that 16 inches, which is 100% maturity, is a max of age 5. So this actually kind of makes sense considering what we're seeing in the length composition. And then when you specifically look at the top portion of the figure, which represents the older fish, we're actually starting to see smaller proportions of older fish, specifically the age 10 plus, which I've outlined in black just to be so y'all can see it a little bit easier. Now, with the implementation of sample collection in 2013, there was an initial increase in older fish, which you expect as you get more samples, you're gonna expand your age classes. And this included several fish age 25 or greater. However, after that 2018, 2019 time period, these fish are no longer observed, though the number of samples collected has increased. And while you're like, yeah, but length comps, you're showing there's not a lot of those larger fish in your length comps. That's true, but there is a lot of overlap in size at age. So even with some of the smaller fish, we would still expect to potentially see some older fish in the population. So that's the data. Moving forward, just a quick summary. Directed recreational trips have doubled since 2020 after remaining steady. The proportion of rec anglers harvesting 4 or more sheepshead is starting to increase, even though that's slight. Commercial effort is slowly increasing, though that's after trending down to a historic low. And what's really driving the commercial fishery is more the average pounds per trip increasing, especially in the pound net fishery. Landings in 2024 were the highest for both sectors since implementation of management and some of the highest landings historically. And the majority of sheepshead harvested from 2016 to 2024 are potentially immature fish with fewer, larger, and older fish showing up in our samples. So what does all this mean moving forward? And I promise this is my last slide. With next steps, the division is currently evaluating potential management changes for sheepshead. We are working on that issue paper. We will be holding public hearings in the late fall to get input on management changes such as minimum size limit changes, recreational bag limit, implementation of vessel limits, commercial trip limit changes. I think currently we are planning on 1 virtual and some in-person public hearings, and these, I think, are supposed to be held very end of October, beginning of November. And our goal for management implementation is in 2026, hopefully within the first quarter, though to be determined.